and good morning. My name is Denise Cooper, and I have been a member at the Apache Software Foundation since 2005, and I have keynoted various ApacheCons over the years. This is the first time I'm doing ApacheCon Asia as a keynoter, although I did attend the first ApacheCon Asia. And I am here to talk to you about open source as an active thing and an active discipline that we have to teach together as part of the job of being an Apache software member. Okay, so obviously this is the OSI logo. There are some people at Apache that are not pro OSI. I helped run the OSI for 10 years, so I very much believe that the OSI has performed a service by creating a standard for the licensing. In a little while, we're going to talk about whether that's sufficient to create open source. So here we go. Okay, so I started working on open source in 1999. That was the year that I got hired by Sun Microsystems to open source Java. And because Java was very much a language built for the web, Apache was interested in Java. Not all of Apache. There were people in Apache that didn't think it was reasonable for there to be so much emphasis on Java in the Apache Software Foundation. And the Software Foundation was only actually incorporated in 2000, although it had been going on for several years before that. Because I was involved with Java, I ended up having a large following of famous friends, and some of them are in this next picture. This is a founders picture, recent founders picture at an ApacheCon. I think this was in North America, 2019 maybe, or 2020. That was a big anniversary year for us. So we all spent a lot of time together again. All of these people are originals in the creation of the Apache Software Foundation as a nonprofit. Two of them, the two in the middle, Roy Fielding and Brian Bellendorf, are generally acknowledged as the co-founders of Apache. And the rest of the folks are all people who've been around quite a bit. You guys probably recognize Jim Jagalski there. There's some other people you might not recognize, but they have, trust me, been around since the beginning. And they created this codification of how to do open source in response to some interesting things that happened to them when they founded the Apache Software Foundation. So Roy there in the blue shirt did his master's thesis on the Apache Way and how Apache works. He wrote a very nice paper about the mechanics of the Apache Way that are still a lot of how we understand the Apache Way today. Now, he wrote his PhD thesis on a little thing called RESTful APIs. He's much more famous for that. But his first work was thinking about the method of massively peer-reviewed parallel programming at scale on the internet, which is what the Apache Way tries to come up with ways to make that work well. So I started out with these guys coaching me because I definitely was not an open source person in 1999, but I was in charge of a very popular project, which was open sourcing Java. And some people, notably Brian, felt very strongly that that should happen at Apache. So I spent a lot of time with these folks. And a lot of it rubbed off on me. For instance, the idea that open source is not just a license. Again, I worked at the OSI before and during the time that I've been an Apache member. And I do think that that's a real service that the OSI provided to the open source world, the larger open source world, by figuring out what the open source definition, how it expresses itself in licenses, and being, if you will, the traffic cop for, no, this is not an open source license that we approve. Therefore, you can't call that license open source and get, open source halo effect. That's most of what OSI did, that we were trying to make it so that not every open source engineer needed to also be a lawyer. We didn't, unfortunately, there are a lot of us that became sort of expert in lawyerly things along the way. But Apache had this insight that it's not just the license. Everything at Apache is licensed under the same license, Apache Software License 2.0. And we worked hard on that license based on what came up for us out in the world around that time. I say we because I did get a little involved in the creation of the 2.0 version. But the license is only the beginning. Putting the code out under that open source license is only the beginning. That is not the verb that I'm talking about when I say open source has to be a verb. It's also the case that Apache learned a lot about big companies and their willingness to, let's say, elide the truth of what they're actually doing in the interest of getting in on a good marketing program. When Sun started doing open sourcing of Java, they were not using a real open source license. That's part of how I got involved in the OSI, was that I agreed with the OSI that Sun's license was not open enough, was not adherent to the open source definition. And I worked pretty hard in the 6 years I was at Sun to push them in the direction of a better choice. One of the things that happens still, even today, in the world of open source is there are companies who it's so different than the way that they run things that they cannot conceive of how to get to open source, but they want to get the halo for doing it. And so they land their open source program office in the marketing department, and they start essentially amplifying inconsequential actions as though they were earth-shattering, because for them they are. But that's not the same as doing real open source. And for a long time, at the beginning of Apache, after the foundation was created, there were large companies that were trying to use the Apache name and their proximity to it as shorthand for we're cool, we're doing open source. They were essentially selling snake oil using the Apache name. And so that's why the incubator was started, because Apache realized that it had an obligation. If it believed that the Apache way was the right way to do things, it realized that we had an obligation, if we were going to take in code from contributors that were not known open source contributors, we were going to have to teach them how to work in our way so that the community could go forth together with community over code. So that's why the incubator was created. And there are still a lot of companies trying to sell you snake oil about their open source programs. That's because they don't understand. It's too far removed. And if they're not engaging with Apache, then how are they going to learn, right? Well, this is what was running around my head when I started working for PayPal. So these are the principles of open source as I understand them. First of all, as evidenced by this picture, transparency. It can be an inverted transparency, meaning you don't have to explain why it's upside down. You just have to post everything that you're talking about and let the people that are trying to contribute with you understand through reading your actual words, your actual interactions. That kind of transparency is so different than the traditional way of developing software at this point that it's a specialty. And it's still the case that there are many companies that are afraid of open source. However, some of the biggest names in hating open source back in 2000 have come around, notably Microsoft. Microsoft actually went and hired a substantial number of Apache contributors to help them figure out how to make Azure be a real open source project. And along the way, they treated it like an edge activity, like most companies do, until they got some responses. They saw that this was the right way to do things. And at this point, they're using InnerSource pretty effectively to try to train the rest of their workforce, the people that didn't work on Azure, in how to do real open source. They're not our enemies anymore. That's kind of the biggest sea change that happened in the 23 years that I've been involved in open source. And going on 24 now, wow. So that's the main principle, but there are a couple of others that I learned from Apache. One of them is to level the playing field. You cannot host an Apache effort without leveling the playing field. There's a few failed examples that show this principle really clearly. And I'm going to call out OpenOffice because I was involved in the creation of that project as any competitive goad for Microsoft back in the day. And I will be the first to say that Sun did not run it as a proper open source program. There was a large community, but they were a community of users. There was a community of contributors, but the Sun engineers mostly kept their contributions from making it into the product. And we fought long and hard to try to shift that situation. It wasn't until Oracle bought Sun and that group of potential contributors that were having so much trouble getting Sun to do anything saw the writing on the wall that Oracle was not going to maintain the project properly. And so they forked and created something called LibreOffice. And LibreOffice is a better version of OpenOffice. If you're using OpenOffice now, Apache OpenOffice, it's a reference implementation, but it is not the best version if you're actually trying to get work done. And I think personally that that's a problem. And I've spoken about that with Apache many times. I'm hopeful that that situation will right itself eventually. But in the meantime, the idea that you want to create a level playing field, which means that contributors are your equals and you will seriously review and accept their pull requests along with your own. You will not try to push your agenda through the Apache incubator, is a really core part of the Apache Way. And then another piece of the Apache Way that I've been very interested in lately is the auditable trail of conversation. So Apache decided a long time ago, back when email was one of the only ways to communicate on the internet, that everything was going to happen on email lists. And if it wasn't on the list, if it never was published to an Apache email list, then even if there were a lot of people in the room when a given decision was taken, it doesn't exist until it exists in the mail archive. And so a big piece of the Apache Way is that the last thing you're supposed to do once you're ready to merge a change or ready to embark on a new direction based on a conversation you've had in person with other Apache people or off the mail list even, the last thing you're supposed to say to each other is, okay, who's putting this on the mail list? Because if you don't put it on the mail list, it never happened. And the reason that's so important is because it allows a distributed group of like-minded people in the community to asynchronously digest, in other words, when they need to know, digest information about choices that are being made. It also allows for vigilance of people who read everything immediately and are able to say, no, wait a minute, that's probably not a good idea. I'm going to say -1 to that. And the idea in Apache that anyone can give a compelling reason to back out a change is another piece of the puzzle. These are principles of open source that are very hard to learn if all you're doing is marketing. In fact, they're not easy to learn if you're actually trying to get work done. That's why some projects stay in the incubator a long time and others sail through because maybe they came in already thinking about open source pretty hard. So the main thing about Apache is that open source is about these core methods of getting things to happen in a choreographed way that allows a large group of asynchronously located developers still do very, very high value work. And I think at this point, the outputs of the Apache Software Foundation more than justify any rolling of eyes about the method and the extent to which Apache tries for homogeneity in how software is developed. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now on these methods. By the way, this is a picture of some guys hurling, and it's here because I live in Ireland. Now I've moved in 2017, and it's really interesting to live outside of the US and look back in on US open source and over on European open source. Europe is making really big strides in their open source efforts right now. So it's a good time for me to be here. Okay, so first, the principle of enlightened self-interest. When I started, Apache was the only place talking about enlightened self-interest. We were saying, look, if people don't have, if people aren't getting what they need out of these interactions, they're not going to stick around. And we're trying to build a big community. So let's look at enlightened self-interest and how we can make that an acceptable goal, an acceptable part of the way the community is run. So this means that you're not going to come back if you're not getting what you need. If what you need is community and a lot of people to talk to, even though you're sitting alone in a room because you're in the middle of a pandemic, then your self-interest is you want connection and these people are talking about things you care about. If if you've invented something that is being open sourced at Apache, your self-interest might be to try to get more people to help you maintain it. It might be to cement a de facto standard. It might be to advertise your abilities so that you will be more easily make money. I remember a conversation with some free software zealots sometime in the aughties, where somebody finally heard someone from Apache say enlightened self-interest, and they were horrified, because to them, it felt like it wasn't ideologically pure to acknowledge that you're getting something in this transaction. But Apache has always seen that get and give have to be balanced, just like the playing field has to be level. So I think this is a unique insight that Apache has and the Apache Way has. Another one is there has to be mentorship. Now, Google Summer of Code is often credited with the idea that mentorship is important. But actually, if you look at the timing, the Apache Incubator is maybe a precursor to Google Summer of Code. The idea that you have to have 2 people on your incubator team who are already members at Apache and already know how the Apache Way works, so that they can monitor and mentor your interactions in the incubator and get you to the point that you are actually doing open source and not just using your weight and your ability to throw resources at things to get things to work out your way. There's some very big companies that have had to learn this. And another piece of this little puzzle is the extent to which mentorship is important. I myself have been guilty of agreeing to mentorship and then not putting the time in. And at Apache, you get called out for that and maybe also replaced as a mentor. And that is a good thing. Another feature of Apache, the Apache Way, is an acknowledgement that not everybody is going to be able to give peak effort every day. And it's set up to be survivable open source. If you can't make a member meeting, you can assign a proxy that allows the community to go forward. If you put in a change, you are prepared to back it out if anybody from the community tells you that it's not a good idea, because it's all transparent. They can't be telling you that because it's going to undermine their business proposition. Open source isn't a business proposition. It's a method of developing software across unimaginably large teams that are geographically dispersed. Mentorship is key to this situation. And then thirdly, inclusion. Now, at Apache, we wouldn't have called out inclusion until relatively recently. As one of the very few female members of Apache at the beginning, I can say that we started talking about inclusion a long time ago, but the overwhelming feeling at Apache was the level playing field means that inclusion is a given. But in our experience, that's not necessarily true. What the experience as women. And so over time, there have been various efforts to try and create a voice for women that's distinct and unique. And these days at Apache Cons, we do have women's lunches, and we have some very prominent women that are involved in the leadership of Apache Software Foundation, which is really helpful. But I use the word inclusion here because I think a lot of the tenets of the Apache Way are fundamentally about inclusion. So for instance, as I said earlier, the level playing field. What do you have to do to create a level playing field where a few people who know everything about the code are not the only voices talking in the room? Well, the mentorship thing is a big part of it, but there's a few other sort of esoteric things about the way to run a proper project with a level playing field. So one of them is, don't try to be the expert. The first time a question is asked, there need to be people who understand the code well enough to answer those questions so that the new community can get up to speed and onboard themselves very quickly. You want all of those questions to be answered on the record. So the first time a question is asked, it's reasonable for one of the mentors to answer the question carefully and thoughtfully and fully. It's reasonable for the leads on the project to be the people doing that as well. But after the question has been asked and answered, it's imperative that you not answer again immediately. If another person asks the same question or a very adjacent question, it is your job to sit back and allow the playing field to be level. Allow somebody who heard your answer now be the expert and answer that second questioner. The more you can promote that idea that you're building expertise across the organization or within the project by allowing people to digest and then be the expert, be the mentor, pushing mentorship down and down into the available stack of helpers, that's inclusion. And that's been basic to Apache since the very beginning. There are a couple of other things that I think are part of Apache inclusion. I think that the durable archive of the email that I was talking about earlier, where if it didn't happen on the list, it didn't happen, that archive is useful primarily to allow people to onboard themselves without taking the expert's time. They can educate themselves about what has come before by reading in that archive. And that is something that is starting to be lost even in Apache projects, because now there's a hegemony of tools and people are trying to use Slack, for instance. Now, we always had the mail list, and we also always had IRC. And there are a number of places where IRC is used, but it's very carefully logged, and those logs are entered into the mailing list record. So it's, this is an important thing that we organize all of the information about the project in a way that anyone can read into it. Not everybody reads English at the same rate. It might be important to make sure that people have time, adequate time to digest the information. And the mailing list definitely does that. So those to me are the three big parts of the Apache Way that are important for teaching new people how to do open source. And using those things, I started in 2014, something called InnerSourceCommons.org. Now, the term InnerSource was not coined by me. It was coined by Tim O'Reilly when he and Brian Behlendorf started a company called Collab.net that was set up to help companies learn how to do open source, both public open source and using the method inside the company. And InnerSource was the term that Tim gave to using it inside the company. But it hadn't been used in a long time when I started talking about it in 2014. In a way, I was taking my career in my hands because most open source activists wouldn't even touch it because they wanted to produce public open source. So did I. But I had a real feeling that we needed more study behind the firewall, basically more incubator for companies that weren't ever going to give anything to Apache. We needed to still teach those lessons, but in another way. And we do that at InnerSource Commons. These are the current set of companies that are talking about their InnerSource journey. And if you look carefully, you'll see a lot of companies that are big fans of Apache as well. Many have been involved in open source for a long time. Others are more recent entrants, but they're all focusing on learning how to do open source by changing their own engineering methods inside their company to match the way that open source works as much as possible. And some of them even use that as a precursor to allowing public open source. Before you can open source code that you've written for us, even if we've approved the code going out as an open source project, you have to first demonstrate that you know how to build a level playing field. You know how to be inclusive. You know how to, you know that enlightened self-interest is an important part of the stew. You know that you have to do all of your talking in public so that people can onboard themselves from the archive. This is a lot of big companies learning to do this. Now, why did I want that to happen? Well, I wanted it to happen because I believe that most engineers still don't get to work in the open source way, and that is a problem. This poor engineer here is in the salt mines, still making the salt, the old-fashioned waterfall, siloed way that is not about information sharing. It's not about code reuse. It's about hierarchy and somehow trying to muddle through without good communication skills and with only very specific engineers allowed to touch specific pieces of code. I feel like if you agree that this is mostly how people work still, and you'd like to see more engineers know how to work in the open source way so that you could hire them in your company, or so that they could rush in to become maintainers in very important open source projects that now need more maintainership. We can't build maintainers through the schools. It takes too long. We've got a lot of good engineers who just aren't allowed to work the way that we work. If we can convince companies through the idea of enlightened self-interest that they can get better at engineering and be more able to be nimble, then we should by all means do that. And that is the real reason that I started InnerSource Commons. You can get involved by coming to InnerSource Commons. You'll find some very, very friendly and helpful people there. And you'll see lots of things that talk about Apache and the Apache Way. So the next time somebody tells you that open source is scary because it's written by the unwashed masses, or it's scary because it's not secure enough, which has been a big topic lately, or community is just too hard, I think your job as a member of Apache, or as a person who does development even at Apache and wants to become a member, is dive into teaching people how to do open source. Start either at Apache in the incubator by working in the incubator to help people understand the Apache way, or start by going to InnerSource Commons. Say, I'm from Apache and I understand how to do this. Can I answer any questions for anybody? These are both really, really good avenues for spreading InnerSource and helping the community over code be the way everybody develops. Wouldn't that be amazing? All right, well, thank you so much for your time and this keynote. I know this is being translated into some languages, so hopefully it'll get posted with more than one subtrack, a subtitle track. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I'm looking forward to being able to travel to Asia again. If you find yourself in Ireland at the end of the summer here for the European Linux Foundation Open Source Summit, you'll see me there. And in the meantime, you can also reach me on Twitter at Diva Denise. Thank you very much for your time.